Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. For this week's episode, you've got myself, Rachel Sherlock, and joining me this time is my friend, Reba Luiken. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rachel.
It's lovely to have you on. You're a friend of mine from a long time ago. We met when you were doing a year study at University College Cork, and sadly haven't had the chance to meet in person since then. But it's great to be able to connect to you on the miracle of the internet.
Yeah, it's so much fun to be able to hear the whole podcast and can send you Facebook messages or whatever. And
oh, thank you. So do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your areas of interest and maybe what we're going to be discussing today?
Sure. So I am currently the director of Allen Centennial Garden, which is at the University of Wisconsin. So I live in Madison, Wisconsin. And my background is in plant biology, which is where the gardening comes from. And then also I did a major in religious studies and a PhD in history of science, technology, and medicine. So I have lots of different things. Very interested in religion and have been Catholic my whole life. And so it's funny. I was talking to a religious studies professor and she was introducing her cat and she said, "Oh, Junia, blah, blah, blah." And I was like, "Junia, I recognize that name because that's like the apocryphal name of the female pope, right? I think."
Oh, yeah.
So, and I was like, she's like, "Oh, you're a good religious studies student." I was like, it had nothing to do with religious studies. That's like my own hobby in religion. So, very interested in Laudato Si and care for creation. And so that's why we're going to be talking about faith and gardening today.
Yeah, I think it's so exciting. I was just thinking when you were listing out there, it's great that we can cover your interest in gardening and your interest in religion. I'm not sure we're going to get to the history of science and your other areas of expertise, but I do think it's wonderful to be talking about religion and gardening. I know my mum, who is my most faithful listener, is going to be listening to this podcast, and my parents have a large and fairly intense garden. It's not just big, but it's on a slope and the soil is really bad and there's all of these elements to it. And so it's funny because she gardens a lot, but whereas a couple of people I know who garden a lot are very lifestyle based, and it's this big relaxing activity, and my mum's out there with a crowbar trying to break stones out of the ground and things like that. But I think the other part which she'll find funny, which is that despite having this big garden growing up, I definitely was not a helpful child when it came to the garden. I didn't have a lot of interest and I didn't have a lot of the necessary dedication and strength and all of those things. But in recent years, I have come into gardening and I have started helping my parents with their garden. I have a balcony in this flat, which is amazing because it's the easiest place in the world to grow anything because it sits under somebody else's flat. So all of the heat comes up. So it's a nice little microcosm for us. My Phoebe, my other co-host and flatmate, she's a bit more of a green thumb than me. And we grew tomato plants last year that honestly took over the whole flat. So we were we're going to grow maybe one or two this year, not 10. It was too many. But yeah, so definitely finding gardening something that intrigues me more and more as I get older and really loving it. I think I mentioned on the podcast before as well that I'm obsessed with watching, there's a BBC program called Gardener's World, which is I think it's kind of older people programming, but we love it.
I was talking to my mom. She liked to watch the Great British Bake Off, and but the thing I really love is how they have all these cool clips of bees and flowers in between when they cut between the scenes.
Oh, it's lovely, and I think that's it. There's a kind of fascination that comes with the natural world when you start to garden, whether you're in the wilderness or whether you're in, a small little patio garden, whatever it is. It's not that everyone who is interested in nature gardens, but I think if you're really a gardener, you can't not be interested in nature. And And I think that's where we can kind of start with the faith, because I think it's gardening is one of those things that really grounds you in creation and reminds you of the gift that is creation, and that we exist in a physical space of creation, whether that's in our own bodies or in the world that we're interacting with.
Right. I think there is something about this modern world, right? Like, we're on Zoom all the time and we're on the internet, and it's like, I could be doing that anywhere. But when you go outside, like, there's something really special about being in a specific place. And it's not the same, like, where you are, right? Like, the weather is it's warmer there than it is here today. And like, I just remember being in Ireland, and the thing that struck me was like the colors of the landscape are different. Like, all of a sudden the primary colors of the landscape were like gray and green.
Yeah.
And here it's much, I feel, more brown and blue.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. It is funny how, and like, we get called the Emerald Isle. There is something about Ireland that is particularly verdant and green. But like you say, yeah, that there are these specifics wherever you go, and there's something to see and appreciate in each kind of landscape. Like, there are people who go to enormous lengths to grow kind of tropical jungle wildernesses in their back gardens, or their sort of desert plants, and those can be beautiful. But there is also something about entering into what naturally grows in the landscape, or what is fitting to this exact place, or looking into why certain plants grow in certain areas. And yeah, I think embodiment is a word that came up, and you recommended 2 books by an author. It's Vigen Guroian, is that it?
Yeah.
And he's an Armenian Orthodox writer who writes beautifully. He's written, as far as I can see, he's written quite a lot of books, but he's written at least 2 specifically on planting and gardening and nature that were really great. I loved reading them. One was called Inheriting Paradise, and the other was called The Fragrance of God.
I remember so I took an Eastern Orthodoxy class in undergrad, and the professor, basically, we had to do an independent project, and so I was spending all of this time learning about Eastern Orthodoxy and the environment, and I feel like that was the first time I really spent a lot of time like thinking about Christianity and the environment, because there's like this overarching narrative of like whether the creation story and like the way that God told Adam, you're supposed to take care of the animals, like what does that really mean, and is that in conflict with like a creative environmental ethic, or does it support it? And that was, of course, long before Laudato Si and any of those things came along. But the whole, basically, thesis that Vigen Guroian and my professor were talking about was, well, in Eastern Orthodoxy, we don't have that dichotomy. That's a Western Christianity problem. We just are much more spiritual and involved, and like to see nature as praising God, and us praising God through nature, and God isn't nature, but God is in nature. And so like thinking about those things on a more spiritual level, as opposed to like a real like logical academic level. I don't know. I sometimes think like one of the main differences between Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy is that the Catholics, like their theology is so much like Thomas Aquinas, like proofs, and like we have to prove everything logically, and it feels a little more freeing to be in like this Orthodox space where it feels more experiential. And of course this is coming from a non-expert, but it's more about like how do you walk through the world and experience it. And
and of course none of that is actually in contradiction with Catholicism, but like you said, there can be a slight overemphasis on a particular mode of approaching like God and analyzing God in terms of theology. I know you will remember our UCC chaplain, Brother Richard, and he's a Capuchin friar, and he speaks a lot about Celtic and Christian conceptions as well, which again feel more in tune with nature, or we have our own Byzantine rites or Eastern Church Catholic rites that could help inform us in this way. And like you said, there's a wealth of wisdom that we can learn from our Orthodox brothers and sisters that is about a less analytical and yet still deeply, richly intellectual way of approaching Christ. And I think the interesting thing that you said there was that it's a spiritual approach. And yet at the same time, what Vigen is kind of getting at is that spiritual does not mean to the detriment of physicality. And that he writes really strongly about his kind of abhorrence of the idea that he feels has so captivated a lot of people, which is that your bodies are something that will be left behind. Your bodies are irredeemable. They're not part of your kind of spiritual journey, that they're just like a burden that will be released from when we get to heaven, and we don't have to deal with that anymore. And so he really speaks about the physical connectivity of actions like gardening and other things, and walking and using our body to encounter Christ. And he has a quote from, this is in Inheriting Paradise, but he says, "The internet may even trick us into thinking that having a body and a place is not important. Gardening teaches us differently. I do not mean industrial, mechanized farming. I mean the kind of gardening that any one of us can do with his hands and his feet and the simplest tools." And at another stage, he says, "The mystical enjoyment comes not without the toilsome struggle of raking and sowing and pulling up the weeds. In my garden, the thistle grows more easily than the primrose. Sin grows in my body more readily than purity. And the keys to my garden do not admit me back through Eden's gate." And so there's this real sense of like actually seeing how the physical exertion of our bodies in order to cultivate beauty through creation, beauty and also utility in terms of growing vegetables and other more practical plants, but both utility and beauty through physical exertion, but through God's grace of the gift of creation and growing and living things.
Right. And I think that there's something, I'm like notorious for like, let me lay out the garden plan and I'll tell you where the plants are going to go and we'll get it all set up. And then like not being that interested in like actually pulling, well, I like pulling weeds, but just like going out there and maintaining the garden all of the time.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, I think he really brings up the important point of like, you actually have to do it, right? It's an embodied practice. So as much as like, you know, it's great. Like we have all of these, you should meditate and you should do, you know, all of these like daily practices and do your journaling and all of those things. Like actually doing them is the important part. And I think that's true in the garden too, right? Like you actually have to go out and pull the weeds. You actually have to go and water and harvest your vegetables.
Yeah. And that like how quickly it all goes. This is what me and my mom always talk about, which is that like, you know, I cleared one of our pathways in the garden of like all of the weeds, and it was all weeds, and I pull them all up. And then I come back, you know, 2 months later. And like on some level, it's like I might as well have not even done it, you know, that like as soon as you stop working at it, it immediately goes back to the way it was, and the weeds and the brambles and the thistles. And in our garden, which is amazing, it just trees everywhere. We're near a forest, and like we would just be taken over with oak trees if we didn't pull them up. They're everywhere, and they're so hard to pull up after a certain time. So you have to keep you do have to keep fighting for it. It's something that like it isn't a single action that you complete and then you're done. It's an ongoing thing. And I think you're so right about saying that it's actually living, and it's actually practicing, and it's actually encountering, and it's not theoretical. I'm reading Walden. It's so funny. I was just saying to you before we started recording, I recorded an episode on kind of nature and the seasons 2 years ago called Springing into the Season. And I said in that one that I wanted to read Walden, and I'm like, oh, here I am 2 years later. And then finally reading it, I'm getting there. But also it was funny, I heard myself say, oh, there's the cladding on our flat is creaking because there's a lot of wind today. And I'm recording this episode exactly 2 years later in the middle of a storm with my creaking cladding. So if anyone can hear creaks, that's just the roof. But it's funny how some things change and some things don't. But I am reading Walden by Henry David Thoreau. And I'm kind of surprised because I'd read some of the more nature-centered chapters before, but I'm reading it cover to cover this time, and he takes a long time to get to talking about nature. And the first couple of like sections are all about economy and like the practicalities of building, and he has a lot of sort of his ideas of the world, but it's still really relevant to our topic today because he has this section about why it's important to go out and do these things yourself, and that there's one section where he says about like we have professors of philosophy, but we don't have any philosophers anymore, which I think is a really interesting statement, especially like considering how long ago that was for us, another 200 years ago. But he says, he's talking about students, and he's conjecturing that he says, but, says one, you do not mean that the students should go to work with their hands instead of their heads. I do not mean that exactly, but I mean something which he might think a good deal like that. I mean that they should not play life or study it merely, while the community supports them at this expensive game, but earnestly live it from beginning to end. How could youths better learn to live than by at once trying the experiment of living? Methinks this would exercise their minds as much as mathematics. If I wished a boy to know something about the arts and sciences, for instance, I would not pursue the common course, which is merely to toss him into the neighbourhood of some professor, where anything is professed and practised but the art of life. To survey the world through a telescope or a microscope, and never see it with his natural eye, to study chemistry and not learn how his bread is made, or mechanics and not learn how it is earned. So that kind of sense of there's a real temptation to spend our lives commenting or thinking about or discussing without ever having actually engaging in doing. And I think about that a lot with like, I love talking about literature and I love talking about films. And I'm not saying that it's my vocation in life to be a filmmaker or, I don't know, to be an author or whatever it is. It might be. maybe someday I'll turn around and do it. I'm not saying that you have to be doing those, actually making them to be able to comment on them. But I do think there is a trap that we fall into where we spend all of our time talking about things and not actually making them or not actually creating. And all you're doing is creating commentary.
Yeah, I think it's funny that Thoreau says this in a way because when I read Walden, I too was disappointed by how little nature there was because I was expecting more. But also, when he goes into nature, to an extent, he's sort of just playing nature. Like he's not really surviving there. So take his opinion with a grain of salt, perhaps. But I do think, as you were reading that, it's funny. I was having a conversation with my husband the other day about how wouldn't it be more useful in high school if we learned about the chemistry of baking bread as opposed to just like abstract chemistry, right? Like that you do chemistry in your daily life. But one thing that I've been trying to do, and I am not disciplined at it, but I started teaching and learning about nature journaling. And the amazing thing about it in trying to like learn how to sketch something is how many trees I have looked at in my life and not really looked at. Like in my head, there's an idea of a tree, but like in trying to actually physically draw the tree and like I have to look at it so much more closely than I ever have before. And it's amazing. Like I'm not a skilled artist. I haven't been trained as an artist, but I can draw a tree if I actually really look at it closely and like follow my eye along the line of the branch as I draw with a pencil. And so I know so much more about trees now, having drawn 10 of them over the past 2 years than I did before, because I just haven't ever looked that closely at them.
I know. I think that's amazing. I've taken up some painting recently and it just makes you, it's so amazing how little you can take in of what's around you that like you said, it's almost like you have a picture of a tree that you're given when you're a kid. And then whenever you look at trees, you just sort of stick that on top of it. Like if you're told to recall it from memory, you're not actually thinking about the tree that you saw. You're just thinking about the tree that's in your mind from the picture book when you were a kid. Like that's what a tree looks like, that like to actually take the time to sit and really look and engage with and question. I totally agree that like that's such a foundational way of approaching learning things, and it's really beautiful. And there is that sense of like, God created this world, which with such loving care and attention, that when we turn our hands to things like that, it's only then that we give it the kind of attention that God has demonstrated, that we're actually focusing in on it. And I think that was something that you and I were going to talk about, which is just this image of both God and then specifically Christ as a gardener, that like when we do gardening, it gives glory to God, because in the same way that Tolkien always says, and we'll come on to Tolkien and trees and gardening, but with we are made in the image and likeness of a maker, that like when we make things, we are like God, because that's what God does. And so when we garden and when we cultivate and when we raise up creation through our efforts, again, we are emulating God and falling in line with the way that he operates in the way that we've seen him through creation.
Right. And I think that there's this place where Christ is, I don't know, I mean, there's all of this theology around Adam as the first gardener and then Christ as the second gardener, or this very specific example, right, of Mary Magdalene going to find Jesus in the tomb and then seeing the gardener, but it really,
yeah, it's really Christ.
Right, exactly. And it's amazing how many things in Scripture are related to the land. And in the modern world, because I am so disconnected and many of us are so disconnected from it, we don't notice it. I went into a shop once and there was a Bible you could get that had all of the like environmental things highlighted words in green. Like all of those passages were a different color than the rest of the text. And I didn't pick it up. I decided to go with the other, more normal one. But since then, the more that I spend learning about plants, the more that I see it come up. It's amazing just being attuned to it. Like we talk about the earth every week in the and in mass, and it's part of the mass embedded in it, but it's also part of the readings. And in our modern world, I was in mass one day, and we were reading the passage about the wheat and the chaff. And so the priest in his homily was going into what is chaff and what is wheat. And I was just sitting there laughing, going, I literally have a wheat crown hanging above my desk in my office. Like I've been looking at this all week. I know exactly what he's talking about. But not everyone does. And so he has to go into like all of this detail about things that we're disconnected from because we're no longer really an agricultural culture. We live in cities, and a small subset of people farm or garden.
Yeah. And that even, it doesn't necessarily track that everyone who lives in a city doesn't know about nature, but it is amazing how disconnected we are. And I think, I'm always talking to my friends about it in terms of like how we shop for our food and how we interact with the food that we eat, and what does it mean to buy ethically, especially when it comes to food. Because I think, like you said, Christ has put it in our hearts to take the things that we eat seriously, because we also consume him. And so food is a serious thing, and bread is a serious thing, and the things that we consume are serious, and they're serious because they come from creation, and we shouldn't take it lightly. My mom always has this story of me when I moved. I was born in a city and lived there in Dublin until I was 5, and then I moved to a countryside school, and one of our first classes was like a list of spelling and vocabulary, and one of the words was sow, as in female pig, and I was the only one in the class who knew what a sow was when I guess I would have been 6 then. But these were all people who were living in the countryside. Like they wouldn't necessarily all be farmers, but it was definitely like a small town school. And my teacher was just like, how, like, you should be ashamed of yourself, this girl coming from the city and she's the only one who knows what a sow is. But I think it just doesn't cross people's minds sometimes to be interested in that agricultural and in that gardening side of things, that it's just taken for granted that they're just kind of background noise in a life that's otherwise focused on other things. And it's a beautiful and, theologically rich thing to take the time to actually sit with the images of, like you said, in the Mass and in the Bible and in our rich Catholic tradition of gardening and of cultivation and And like you said, I love the imagery, and like the imagery of Adam and Christ is the new Adam, and that includes Adam the gardener and Christ the gardener. I have an article here. It's from Angelus Press. It's called "Christ the Gardener of Our Souls," and it says Adam, who was given dominion over all the earth, squandered his glory by sin. From that point forward, he would only bring forth fruit from the earth by the sweat of his brow. It would be hard work, contrary to the initial order established by God, where Adam was the master of the garden of paradise. He was, in a sense, the gardener, but through his bad stewardship and his disobedience, he betrayed his authority and his God. Contrasting this with Christ, who is mistaken for the gardener, he has just done the work of bringing forth fruit and watering his garden through his passion and death, and complete obedience to the Father. Now that he has triumphed over the world, the flesh, the devil, we find Christ exactly where and how we should expect to find him, as the new Adam in a garden, tilling the garden of our souls, which is just beautiful.
Right. Well, and I'm thinking as you're reading that too about like Ash Wednesday and how we have, they put ashes on our forehead and they say, "You are from dust, and to dust you shall return." And how, connected we are to Adam and Christ and the earth, right? Like, this isn't a Christian quote, but, I think it's Neil deGrasse Tyson will say, you're stardust. All of the elements in your body came from stars, that we are all interconnected with all of these magical, beautiful things. And, in the Christian sphere, right? Like this holy, beautiful creation that has been created and can run in this amazing way. We're all connected.
Yeah, and that in following Christ in this image of a gardener, that we become closer to him, and that we're modeling his actions, like that quote said, like he's exactly where you expect to find him. I have another quote from Norman Wirzba, which I think I referenced him before in our feasting podcast. He writes a lot about the kind of connectedness between gardening and feasting and all of these things. But he says that this means that besides vegetables, flowers, and fruit, gardeners are themselves undergoing a spiritual cultivation into something beautiful and sympathetic and healthy. A caring, faithful, and worshipping humanity is one of the garden's most important crops. And I love that because it really drives home this, I think, very Christian paradox of, I think there was something about mixing metaphors that we're very good at, in the sense that we are both the gardener and the crop. Like Christ is the one who sacrifices and the one who is sacrificed. He is, he is the one who breaks the bread and is the bread. That this combination of both things, that we are both those things at once. And it's funny because actually, and like I said, we're coming back to Tolkien. Of course I have to talk about Tolkien, but he actually says this specifically. He has this section in one of his letters where he's talking about man as a seed and the things that grow out of man. But he goes on to say, a man is not only a seed, developing in a defined pattern, well or ill, according to its situation or its defects, as an example of its species. A man is both a seed and, in some degree, also a gardener, for good or ill. So that sense of this, we are all this seed of potential, but we are also the result of our cultivation of that potential. And that when we really embrace gardening as a model for Christ's action in the world, that's when we do it for good. And there's that great quote of Faramir saying, "Are all your kin of like sort? Your land must be a realm of peace and content, and there must be gardeners held in high honor." And Frodo replies, "Not all is well there, but certainly gardeners are honored." And I think that's such a point of pride, that the hobbits are actually the type of people who raise up gardeners and respect the thing that gardening brings.
Yeah, I remember when I was in Ireland, I hadn't read Lord of the Rings, and I was talking to Phoebe, I think it was Phoebe, who said, "Oh yeah, well, there's a lot of things about trees in there." And I was like, well, that's good. I like trees. I'd be happy to read about the nature.
I think one of my most successful tweets was there was another line from Tolkien where he's complaining about the like plays as in theater, and he says not much about trees as trees can be gotten into a play. Like that's the most Tolkien thing to complain about. The whole genre of theater is not as good as it could be because you can't just go on and on and on about trees.
Yeah, well, so I told you earlier, I was reading this book, Beasts at Bedtime, by an Irish, well, he lives in America, but he's Irish by birth, Liam Hennigan, I think. I don't know,
Yeah.
you pronounce the Irish names better than I can, I'm sure. But his book is all about teaching children about nature by reading them classic children's literature and how basically these nature themes come up in all of them. And so he was talking about Tolkien. He said, Tolkien enjoyed a lifelong relationship with trees and undoubtedly qualifies as an early environmentalist. His mother, Mabel, was a fine botany tour. And according to Tolkien's biographer, under her instruction, he became quite an accomplished botanical artist, though apparently he was more concerned about capturing the feeling of plants rather than their anatomical details.
It sounds very much like Tolkien, that feeling of plants, like really recognizing them. And he genuinely could. That people, I've read quotes which are saying that like people would try to avoid going on walks for him because he'd like stop at a tree for 20 minutes just to look at it. But that's a wonderful thing. Like I think that really informs how he understood the world and creation, and that's what makes the Lord of the Rings so compelling, is because there's a real love of the world and of the earth in it. And, you know, there's a great gardener hero. There should be more gardener heroes like Samwise.
Yeah, I was looking through a catalog of books the other day. They're all garden related. And there's a whole section about like nature in the Winnie the Pooh and the nature of Anne of Green Gables and like The Secret Garden and like just like a whole little cottage industry of nature and different classic books. And I think
they've got me as an audience. I'd buy those.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just, I think, speaks to something about what makes maybe classic literature classic. One of the things I did when I was home on maternity leave when my son was born was he was like the slowest eater. So we spent a lot of time together just like feeding him. And I was looking up different kinds of homeschooling theories, and there's one called Charlotte Mason, and it's all about reading classical literature. And there's this nature philosophy of, you know, when you're young, you have to go and do nature study or whatever. And I don't know, I think there's something, right, like we can pull out the morals of these books and relate them to Catholicism and Christianity. And also part of the reason they're so rich is because they're embedded in someone's real experience of the world. Like the author actually knew about what it was like to live in a place. They weren't just in the internet age or...
Yeah, it's funny. I'm just thinking when we were recording this, I had just released our first episode back, which was about time and scheduling and technology and how that changes things. And I referenced, it sounds like I've only listened to one episode of the Born of Wonder podcast. I have listened to more. I just keep referencing this one. I was really taken with it, where she talks about wonder in a digital age. But one of the things she talks about was an article she was reading about how like I think it was some dictionary of children's vocabulary had taken out a whole load of nature words like otter and brook and, you know, snowdrop, things like that, and replaced them with words like email and vlogger. And like, it's not that, their argument was saying that those are the things that children actually encounter. And like, maybe it's true that they might need to look up what those words mean. But it almost is like, to me, it's like setting you up to fail. Like, it's like, well, they should be learning about otters and they should be learning about snowdrops. And just because they happen to be learning about emails, because that's the world we live in, doesn't mean that you need to capitulate and say that that's what they should be looking up. That, like, I think the classic books that you referenced there, many of them, not exclusively, but many of them our children's literature. And I think there is something about the expectation of childhood innocence that brings things back to basics that actually reminds you of how important nature is. That, like, there's a reason that we want to teach kids the names of animals more than we want to teach them the names of, I don't know, types of buildings, you know, that like there is something deeply within us about a connection to nature, and that feels right to bestow onto kids. Like, I think there's a line at the start of Walden, actually, where he's talking about how we should take it back to basics. Like, every kid looks at a spot of land and says, we should just put a house here and just live here and play house. And like you said, there's almost that element of him playing nature. But there is something like radically fundamental about saying, stripping back all of the layers of civilization, of practicalities that we put onto things, and saying, well, if you're not encountering nature in any way, you're missing out on this most basic thing that you learned as a kid and knew as a kid instinctually on some level, that like it was important to learn about sheep and plants and the sun and the moon, you know?
Right. Yeah. Every night it's like we have to go and find the moon in our house. I have a 2-year-old and he's obsessed with the moon, and he doesn't know which direction it is. So sometimes if it's cloudy, he'll go and check all of the windows. At any of them. I was like, no, there's no moon tonight. We can't see it. That you're reminding me of, so I'm going to go to History of Science land now, but one of the projects that I've been working on is a history of women religious who were botany professors or studied botany as graduate students. And one of them, Sister Remberta Westkemper, who was a Benedictine, taught in a little town in Minnesota at the College of St. Benedict. And she had this quote, "The world doesn't need more wonders, it needs more wanderers." And so she took it upon herself as she was teaching about botany, taking her students on field trips and just teaching them to notice and appreciate God's creation in the natural world. And I just love that quote. I think it's so powerful. I think that there's the temptation within science and life to instrumentalize things and think like the point of learning biology is to, further knowledge or go on to the next stage. But a lot of the sisters that I look at, they realize at some point that they're not just training people who are going on to be scientists. They're training young women who are going to go on to be teachers and mothers and do many different things. An appreciation of nature and nature study might enrich their lives, and therefore all of us, if some people have that skill.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so right. And I think, like you said, I think that's what it associates it so much with childhood, is that everything is a wonder, that like a flower coming up and blooming is a marvel. And it is a marvel to everyone, but it often takes a child to recognize it, that they have such a greater capacity for wonder than we do, and that everything is it's new and needs to be explored and explained, but not explained away. Yeah, and I love another one of the Vigen Guroian books, The Fragrance of God. He has a beautiful quote, which is, "In the pearly petals of the Star of Bethlehem, the mockingbird's evening song, the pomegranate's sanguine seed, the lilac's perfume scent, the eggplant's silky skin, paradise shows itself to holy senses. Through sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch, God meets us in the garden, for he never left it, not even after Adam's banishment, and he has invited us back in. I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise, in the gardens that we grow," which is beautiful. I love that.
Yeah, that's lovely. I mean, I love lilacs, right? So like you walk down the street in spring and you can smell the lilac and to go and find it. This morning we were talking about snow and how it sparkles. So Hans was sitting at the breakfast table and he pointed out the window and he said, "Oh, the snow is sparkling." And we were like, "Yeah, the snow does sparkle." And then I was trying to, I went on like a little tangent. I was like, "Oh yeah, but the snow is warm. It keeps the plants warm." underground. And he was like, no, snow is cold, Mama. Snow is cold. And then I was like, but the plants. And he was like, no, we're not talking about plants. I was like, oh, okay. But I'm notorious for being the person who is excited when it snows.
Mm-hmm.
And so often now I'll be in a conversation with people like, oh, it's snowing. Snow is so annoying. And I'm like, but glitter is falling from the sky. It's fantastic. What are you talking about?
It's definitely a sign that you've gotten older when snow is not an unmitigated good.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's one of those things is like actually taking the time to appreciate the garden and nature as something that can be joyful, you know? Like, yes, we have sun every day. Sometimes I guess in Ireland you don't have sun every day, but you know, it's not a rare, you know, the sun is there, but it's so lovely to just like have the sun hit your skin. And rain also can be lovely. It has to do with your frame of mind, right?
Yeah.
Like if you go into it thinking this is going to be bad, it's no good. But if you like really know, like are in this place and you're noticing it and experiencing it, it can be lovely.
It can. And I think that's where we were also saying earlier that like, I think it's interesting. That's where gardening comes into being a really great metaphor in that it combines, like we were saying about the hard work and the cultivation of virtue and the cultivation of plants and like the kind of back-breaking labor that it can be, or the kind of tedious everyday work or whatever it is. And that does produce results, but it doesn't guarantee results. And that there's always an element of it being God's gift, that like, I can't manufacture a flower to bloom, that like I can just put everything in place as best I can, but it is up to God's goodness that such a thing as a rose blooms at the end of it. That like there is this sense of having to put in the work and then also let God take control and deliver in ways that we're not expecting, and to create beauty. That like it's not actually, as much as we like to act in our lives, that like we have no say over how warm the sun is, and we have no say over what a plant will do and how it reacts, and that it is a little miracle every time you see another flower come up. And I think you really notice it at this time of year, especially in Ireland, because we have our daffodils coming up and our crocuses coming out and our snowdrops are here, that like when you see everything is just grayish and flat and dead, and then these little buds start pushing their way through, and it is a miracle every time.
Right. And it's some right, there's like both the moral like part where it's like, yes, if you put in hard work, you know, and you start small, I think that's always right. Like if you're going to plan the entire garden at once, that might not go very well. But like I think that there's that, right, that like humility and the like, I'm going to take it one piece at a time, and this year I'll plant a little bit, and if that goes well, next year I'll expand. But in the end, it doesn't matter how good of being a better gardener will help because you know how to like help the natural rain, but it doesn't solve everything.
Yeah.
At any point there could be a hailstorm or a drought, and you don't have control over that. That's God.
You can do everything right and still be scratching your head at your puny little plant that refuses to do anything. And you're like, I have no idea what I did, you know? That like, yeah, we don't get to feel like, like you said, we're subjected to the natural world, that everything is kind of a gift. There's a quote from, this is back to the fragrance of God, that says, the garden is the ground of my humility. I think my mum would definitely agree with that. It's definitely something I feel. But the garden is the ground of my humility, as the whole earth should be also. I did not create the butterfly or the spider. I do not possess the beauty of the one or the skill of the other. They, along with the rest of creation, declare a grander design and possess a value that is quite their own and not dependent upon me. And I just think that that's so striking. And it reminded me of coming back to like classic children's literature, the Secret Garden, which you mentioned, which there's this section at the end where they talk a lot about what they call magic, which is like this sort of life-giving renewal that can be experienced when we open ourselves up to the garden and to nature and don't hole ourselves away. And the cousin Colin, who hasn't been outside in years, suddenly finds himself renewed to be outside. I've got another quote. I've got lots of quotes today, but they always called it magic, and indeed it seemed like in the months that followed, the wonderful months, the radiant months, the amazing ones, oh, the things that happened in that garden. If you have never had a garden, you cannot understand. And if you have had a garden, you will know that it would take a whole book to describe all that came to pass there. At first it seemed that green things would never cease pushing their way through the earth, in the grass, in the beds, even in the crevices of the walls. Then the green things began to show buds, and the buds began to unfurl and show colour, every shade of blue, every shade of purple, every shade, every tint and hue of crimson. In its happy days, flowers had been tucked away into every inch and hole and corner. Ben Weatherstaff had seen it done and had himself scraped out mortar from between the bricks of the walls and made pockets of earth for lovely clinging things to grow on. Iris and white lilies rose out of the grass in sheaves, and green alcoves filled themselves with amazing armies of the blue and white flower lances of tall delphiniums or columbines or campanulas. And it's just, again, like the gardener, Ben Weatherstaff, did make those spaces, did allow for those beauties to come through. And yet it's still so much more. It's like this tumbling over blossoming that like every inch is kind of coming alive in a way that you couldn't carefully manufacture.
Right. And it's funny, like we put so much effort into sort of manufacturing these things, right? So I look at, like, there are all these tables of like, there's a 50% chance that the last frost date will be before this date or after, and then there's a 70% chance it will be before this date. And I in the fall, I was like talking about this in a lecture for students, and I had the chart up, and I hadn't really looked at it that closely ahead of time, and so I was looking at it, and I was like, today is October 25th, and we haven't had the last frost yet, and the chances of that are, oh my, less than 5%. We should have had a frost a long time ago. You just don't have control over that. And I think that there's like a metaphor for life in there. Like I've been thinking about, you know, like I want to do this thing and I want to make it happen, and it seems like it's so stressful and it's so hard. What if I just say, well, I'm not really responsible for this? Like it's all the gifts I have from God, and God can make this happen or not make it happen. And, you know, ultimately God is the responsible one. It feels much easier to do that in the garden, right? Like we already have that language. It was an act of God, right? Like
I think that's so right. And I think it really comes back to, you reference Laudato Si, which I really love as a document. And I think it answers to so many of people's questions about, you know, there's a lot of debate about things like climate change or global warming or whatever you want to call it. And I never feel like I have enough information or like the right sources or the wisdom to know what might happen or what will happen or any of those things. But it comes back to that balance that we said, like if you start small, it becomes obvious in the big, which is that we don't have control and that we have to give it over to God. And yet that is at the exact same time coupled with an absolute clarity that it is our hard work and our dedication to do the right thing to begin with that allows for God's grace to flourish. And so there's no, like that stewardship, that idea that we are given this beautiful task of cultivating and minding this incredible creation that we've been given. And that in some ways, to me, it almost doesn't matter at all whether it would impact whether our actions would impact the climate at all. In some ways, like that's obviously a threat that can be looming over people. But at the very same time, even if it made no difference, it would still be wrong, because it is wrong to disregard that any part of God's creation is unimportant and to be trampled on and to be polluted or any of those things, that we are stewards. And I think there was something that I came across when I was researching for this podcast, which was like the word for gardener in the Bible not only means to like cultivate or to grow, but it actually means to keep watch over. And that there is this parental and deeply emotionally connected way of looking at our gift of being the stewards of creation, that like it's not just this sort of title that doesn't mean anything, and it calls us to really love creation and the gift that God has given us.
Right, and I think that goes back to the being embodied and having a relationship with the natural world. I just think, like, Pope Francis says this in Laudato Si, and it comes out of that. Like, part of the reason why we use so many resources from the earth is we don't have a relationship with them. We don't know where they come from. We're not actively involved in, gathering the food that we eat and seeing the chemicals or whatever goes into that, or killing the animals that we eat.
Yeah.
I think that comes up in Haley Stewart's book, The Grace of Enough, where they're like, we didn't eat that much meat because no one wanted to kill the animals that we had to eat. And I think that's so, important. And we don't see the garbage either, right? So, like, when it's done, my cheese had mold on it, so I threw it away. It just goes away, right?
Yeah.
It goes somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. But I don't see it anymore. And just being disconnected from the garden and the way things grow. And
yeah. And I think with our digital age, it's so easy to imagine that everything is just digital and that like nothing has a real world impact. But even that, we never even see the impacts of that. Like, I was reading one thing which was encouraging people to unsubscribe from email lists that you don't actually read, because if so many companies sent so many fewer emails, it would actually take so much less energy that like you would save on the energy needed to produce the data centers to send those emails. And like you just think of an email that comes into your phone. It's like, well, I deleted it. That literally does just vanish into thin air. But it did actually take energy and processing space and computing space that exists in the real world to send that email. And so even the things that we think of as totally disembodied are actually things that are manufactured in the real world, just because nobody sat down with a piece of paper to write 20% sale on all clothes at Marks and Spencer's. Like, just because it wasn't written down on paper and given to you doesn't mean that there wasn't actually a real world impact to creating that. And like, I don't want to necessarily get people so freaked out by the idea that everything we do has this like impact on creation, because I think that can be paralyzing to feel like I can't do anything right. But to make sure that we are actually reflecting on the fact that we are beings in creation and that everything that we do comes from God and from the earth, and that we can't pretend that that doesn't exist. And I think, like you mentioned Haley Stewart's book, that ability to live in the seasons, which actually is really bolstered by our faith, that like the two things go together, that seasons of feasting, seasons of fasting, seasons of eating meat and not eating meat, like all of these things are actually helpful to us to remind ourselves that we are not above the world that we live in.
Absolutely. Yeah, I bought her book when I was in New York City, and so I was reading it on the subway, and it was just like this stark contrast, because I don't spend, like, that was the first time I lived in New York for a month, right? And so there's just advertising everywhere. And I'm reading this book about how to like separate yourself and like be happy with what you have, and like this moral sense. And it's just like, wow, this is such a striking contrast to the way that the world works.
Yeah, Haley's getting a proper shout out. Having been on the podcast in the last episode, we're now coming back to our first book, The Grace of Enough. But I think that is right. And I think that it's always lovely when we can tie. I think I saw something even this morning which was showing how the liturgical season matches the agrarian season, and how that's on purpose, and that's like actually representative of the way that the church actually engages with the gift of creation. And I love that. Like the Vigen Guroian books talk a good bit about that, about like the Assumption Sunday and bringing the first fruits of the harvest, or whether it's Christmas. And he has a beautiful thing of saying for Christmas that we have tamed Christmas and domesticated it. We have taken all of the terror and cold out of that night with our electrified lights. Our real joy escapes us. We compensate, we cover over silent despairs with gay Christmas wrapping, but we know all too well at the appointed hour the wrapping will all be torn away and crumpled in piles, and our lives will be no different after this day is done. We want the joy of our life without the pain of his birth, or the agony of his crucifixion, or the judgment when he returns. But I ask you, why in this season does the holly bear its red berries? And so just always bringing these things back to the lessons that the plants and the earth and the gift of creation can tell us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I went one day. I mean, right, there are always these discussions about how Christmas is really the pagan solstice, and right. So I went one day and I was like, let me just like go and see all of the holy days of obligation and see if we can figure out what they are in like the agrarian calendar. And they match almost one for one. Right. Yeah. There's Easter, is spring, and Lent is that period before Easter. My mother-in-law likes to say when the peasants didn't have any food anyway, because they'd eaten all the food all winter, so they just had to eat soup. And the Assumption was the one, right? So I was like, which is the harvest festival? And so I was looking at it, and in Poland, there's like an alternative name for that day, and it's the feast of like Mary, Mother of Herbs. Matka Boża Zielna.
Oh, wow. So Mary, our Mother of Herbs.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
And so it coincides with like the first harvest of wheat in Eastern Europe.
Lovely. I love that. And like the point there is not to say, oh, these Christian feasts are only just like Christian veneers on something that existed anyway. But again, coming back to Tolkien, it's like, no, it's the fulfillment of those. Like these things existed because God was always showing us these truths through the ways that were available to humanity at those times, but that they come to their fullest understanding and their fullest reality when given their Christian context.
Well, and also just how important living with nature and having food and we're connected to people throughout time, right? Like you celebrate the harvest because the harvest is immensely important to your survival.
Yeah,
you celebrate the solstice and you celebrate Christmas because it's immensely important to your survival that you've made it this far through winter and that the days are going to be getting longer and the sun has come and there's hope again for the future.
Yeah, and I was thinking about it is so centrally tied to the Christian message that it's so deeply woven. Like you mentioned the biblical references and the fact that it's woven through the Mass and how we understand it to be, especially in Easter, like this image of the tree of life, and that not only is Christ the gardener, but he is nailed to the tree of life. Like there's so many layers of imagery and wisdom that we can access in helping us to come to understand the sacraments, and the sacraments as that kind of base of it being the most important. Like we used to celebrate the harvest, and of course that's important. That's what helps you live through the winter. But that we can go beyond that and say the Eucharist is even beyond the first fruits of our harvest, that this is something that transcends all of that and brings us into contact with the divine. And to come back to the Inheriting Paradise book, it says, the Word himself was the first gardener. In the beginning, he planted a tree in the Garden of Eden that grew the fruit of immortal life. But the serpent came into the garden and claimed the tree as his own, until the Word took our flesh and reclaimed it. Nailed to that tree, he made himself the antidote of sin and death. They who nailed the Lord to the cross did not know that it was his from the beginning, that the selfsame dead instrument of execution was and is forever more a living tree, the tree of life that produces the food and drink of the kingdom of heaven. And that's just so beautiful. And I just love how we can see so many layers of our faith and our experience of life through these images of the reality of creation.
Right, and how interconnected it is. It's not, I think often we're like, it's the one tree, right? Like there's an oak tree outside, or I have a maple tree in my yard. But increasingly, we can learn from the Bible and from God, like how interconnected these things are. It's not just a tree. It's part of a larger whole. And then science, can catch up and say like, oh yes, there's the mycorrhizae under the ground and the trees nurse each other. And there's this scientist, Suzanne Simard, in British Columbia, and all of her research is about how trees communicate with each other.
Wow.
And how important it is. She uses this term, wood wide web of information transfer and nutrient transfer, and how mother trees are nursing their seedlings and their offspring, and different species work together. And it just, again, like enriches this idea that we have of what creation is.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I love that. And that it works its way down all to the like smallest details. I think you have some pulled out, and I've referenced this before, but like the ways that we name flowers and how that helps us to maintain that sense of connection and perspective and Catholic and Christian lens on it, like marigolds being Mary's gold. And I love this. The French called foxglove Gant de Notre Dame, Our Lady's gloves. Like, what is it? Like, are they on her little fingers? Like fox, that's the size of like a fox's paw. But or of course the rose and all of those beautiful ways, or like the shrinking violet of like Our Lady's bowing head, that like having this rich tradition really helps that stay in our minds and could actually form a way of, even like you said, engaging with science, like expecting to find and looking for these profound truths in our nature, and looking at the ways that they kind of surprise us, like you were saying about the interconnectedness. That's amazing. I love it.
Right. Well, and the way that this is also like a soapbox, right? But people are like, oh, science is supposed to be unbiased. But that's not possible. Everyone brings their background and what they're going to discover and what they're going to investigate with them from some other outside experience, or, the past research they did or whatever. And so I think it's important to, take that in mind. It does matter, I think, to be a Catholic scientist or to be a Catholic teacher or to be experienced in nature. Like, to be a naturalist scientist is not something that's presumed either. There are plenty of people who study ecological interactions who can't identify the ecological organisms they're studying.
Yeah, that really comes into the Walden thing of like studying it without ever actually seeing it.
Right.
And that's like you were saying, and it comes back to interconnectedness. Like in some ways, that's why it might be a truly better way to approach science, which is to start with your coloring pencils.
Well, that's what we do. Yeah. So when I'm teaching nature journaling, it's like, well, the art and the science are not separated from each other. And in fact, inquiry has multiple ways of, like, there are multiple ways of inquiring about the world. How you answer questions is going to depend on what the question is, right? So science answers some questions, but it doesn't answer all of the questions, right? The answer of, like, why are the flowers beautiful? That's not a question you necessarily answer. Or my go-to example is, which kind of garden should you plant on this plot of land? Right? You have a plot of land. If you plant food, you can feed people. If you plant a rain garden, you can clean the water. If you plant a rosary garden, you can help people meditate. All of those things are good, and we could use science to measure the good for any of them. But you can't do all three. And science isn't going to tell you which one of those things to do. That's a moral question of which thing is better or more important at this moment.
Yeah. Or should you just plant a flower garden and say, I'm going to do it because it looks beautiful, and challenge them to pull the data set that shows the outcome of good from that. Which, just because you can't necessarily do that doesn't mean that there's no good in having a flower garden.
Well, you can actually. So there's data that nature is. I mean, right? So there's data for everything, more or less. They've done research that nature stimulates your natural curiosity, essentially. So it's really helpful for students to have a window to look out, or to be able to go outside, because it takes a lot of mental energy to actually focus on lessons, but your brain will naturally focus on the natural world or a garden. Your brain is designed to be engaged by the natural world.
I just think that's so fascinating about how it just comes so much back to basics of like, oh, of course we should show kids the natural world instead of just being in school all day. And that, like, again and again, these things seem to eventually be backed up by scientists. Like, I don't know whether you get this experience, but you see headlines of like, scientists discover, and what they've discovered is a truth known to man until 5 minutes ago, that was probably for most people so obvious that it didn't need a scientific survey to discover. That's not to say that there's no merit in it. In some ways, like I said, it reaffirms it, because you say, look, it is actually backed up by science. There's the moral messaging that we can get from our faith, and there's the intuition that we get from being a human, and that we can actually, in many ways, correlate that to data, like you said, and that it's amazing the things that you would think couldn't be captured by data that are actually rendered. You're able to see their impact and see what good that they produce. And then it always comes back to, well, then why don't we just go and do that?
Right. Well, and the same thing happens, I mean, when people study like the impact of religion, right? So they'll go and they'll say, we can see the benefits of meditation. Like, there's scientific data that praying is beneficial, or there's scientific data that fasting is healthy, right? That goes back to like the liturgical seasons, right? Like the historic calendar, but basically right after the Second Vatican Council, there was sort of a reform, and by and large, Catholics did away with, not that they were supposed to, but giving up meat on Fridays, for example. Yeah. And now we have meatless Mondays, which I just think is hilarious. I was like, meatless Mondays. Didn't somebody already come up with this? Like, maybe we should not eat meat on Fridays.
I know. I think there was somewhere in New York where the schools brought in like vegan Fridays, and all of the Catholics were like, well, that's kind of a win.
But like, yeah. The Ember Days is like, right, every 3 months approximately, and you fast for 3 days, and they coincide with different feast days and also different celebrations of nature. So I don't have there's a cool graphic that I don't have in front of me, but it's like, you know, one of them is the wheat harvest, and one is the oil harvest, and one is the grape harvest. And they're all tied in to the main Italian Mediterranean harvest festivals that don't really relate to my life in North America. But I think it's just really interesting to think about how the liturgical calendar has been so tied into nature, and also tied into what we need to function well as humans.
Yeah. It's the thing of being rightly ordered, and that we see it borne out in science, which looks at, you know, what is the most efficient or effective, or what's the most beneficial ways to do things. And it's borne out by this rightly ordered life. And like you were saying about the liturgical season, it is amazing how much we can learn from it. I was mentioning to you before we were recording that I read, a couple of years ago, I read Benedict XVI's book, Spirit of the Liturgy, which is a lot about how to conduct the liturgy. But he has this fascinating section which is talking about the liturgical year, and then specifically puts it in the context of the Southern Hemisphere. And while obviously the things are inverted, like things like we say, like the days are getting shorter after the feast of John the Baptist, like I must decrease so that he can increase, and like there's all this imagery with like the length of days and things like that. But he actually takes the time to show some of the ways that we can also find other truths and other perspectives on it when we're looking at the liturgical year from the perspective of the Southern Hemisphere. And I thought that was such a thoughtful and interesting section to put into that book.
Right. Well, and that, I think, becomes the question, right? Is it this universal religion started in one place and then went around the world? And then, how does it relate to
Mm-hmm.
the experience of people elsewhere?
And that it can be truly universal. And of course, there are some things that, like you said, based on the Mediterranean experience, okay, it's not exactly replicable, even in Ireland, let alone in Wisconsin, but that there are still shades and peculiar perspectives that all help in coming to this full understanding of creation. Like I was telling my UK colleagues that in Ireland, the 1st of February is the first day of spring. Whereas I think, a lot of people wouldn't consider it that way. Like spring comes much later. But in Ireland, in some ways, it's more about looking at the very beginning of things and being there for the whole journey of them coming up and like almost anticipating it rather than sort of waiting for it and then saying, okay, it's arrived. All of the things are growing now. That like you put it at the start where you can say, now's the time to be looking for those things coming up. And now's the time to be looking for those beginnings. And I think that's really beautiful. So in Ireland, we're firmly in spring right now.
Right. Well, I spent some time thinking about that before, and it's like, well, if spring starts at the 1st of February, then midsummer is when we celebrate midsummer, right? Like the rest of the world right on seasons are like midsummer is really the first day of summer, but
yeah,
right, the historical feast. And then I realized, so here we have Groundhog Day, which is, and I always forget if it's February 1st or February 2nd, but essentially the groundhog decides if he sees his shadow, there's 6 more weeks of winter. If he doesn't see his shadow, then spring starts.
Yeah.
And those 6 weeks are exactly the 6 weeks between February 1st and March 21st, more or less, right? So it's exactly that difference between when spring starts.
So amazingly, despite all of these differences, a groundhog has united those. Humans have created a system where a groundhog bridges those two gaps. Yeah, I think that's it. And so, that's a peculiarly Irish perspective that we bring to that season. And it is slightly different. And I think it reflects some older traditions, like you said, where midsummer would be the middle of it. Like I said, there's almost a sense with a lot of people's calendars now that you're waiting for the climax to say it starts, that whereas we kind of track a little bit earlier. But that like all of these variations bring their own knowledge and wisdom, and that like there isn't one set answer to everything in creation because it's so vast and because it has so many elements and because it changes obviously wherever you go, but that there are these truths that are borne out no matter what through our faith.
Yeah. Well, I have to say in Minnesota, starting spring on March 21st is similarly anticipatory. We don't really get spring until May 1st. So,
which is technically the start of summer for us.
Exactly. Yeah. So it works. Yeah. We just have to modify it for the climate.
Absolutely. But yeah, I think that's wonderful. So I think that kind of covers over a lot of what we were wanting to discuss. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
I don't think so. Not particularly. I'm sure I'll think of something later, but
but no, wonderful. And thank you so much. I know this episode has kind of been long coming. Reba reached out to me a good while ago, and as the seasons slip by through my fingers, it is finally coming to fruition now. But I'm really grateful to have you on and to bring your perspective and your particular areas of expertise to talk about this subject. So before we go, I have to ask, what are you enjoying at the moment?
All right. Well, I'm enjoying a toddler, which is just there's challenges and joys, but he has such a good way of experiencing the world. You can just be patient enough to go along with him. But what I was actually going to say is I recently read a book, or listened to it really, called Joyful by Ingrid Fettel Lee. And it's all about finding like the importance of joy and how there's just this like the modern world, and I fall into this trap all the time of like, it's not important to be joyful. That's like, like having balloons or sparkles or sprinkles, they're just like, that's superfluous.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to like the liturgical seasons too, of actually celebrating things and having a Christmas tree or, putting up decorations for Easter is important. And that's how we have survived for millennia. And
I mean, if God thought it was important to have flowers.
exactly. Right. Well, that's what, and she says that too, right? Like the importance, like flowers are beautiful. Like it's not a moral slight to want to go and buy flowers for yourself. That's a good thing. And so that's, I mean, toddlers are perfect at that, right? They know sprinkles are so exciting and every little thing and stopping to smell the flowers.
I love it. I'm going to say I went to some charity shops recently and I came across a vinyl of the Mary Poppins soundtrack. And Mary Poppins, I don't know, I feel like it's quite a spring film story. I don't know whether that's just because it takes place on Cherry Tree Lane. Like I can't actually remember whether it takes place during spring, but anyway, it feels quite seasonally appropriate and it's lovely listening to the lovely long soundtrack. And coming from a charity shop, it's in like slightly more worn condition, but it has that lovely crackle to it and it's very nice. So that's what I'm enjoying at the moment. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, you can reach out to us. You can subscribe to our newsletter, which is on my website, rachelsherlock.com/podcast. Or, follow us on Instagram or on Twitter. The handle is at Risking Enchantment Podcast on Instagram. I'm just on Twitter at Seeking Watson. And I think this should be coming out at the start of Lent. So I wish all of our listeners all the best for their Lenten preparations. And I hope you're also enjoying the seasons and getting out and seeing what God has to offer in creation at this time of year and at every time of year. So thanks again for listening. Goodbye. Hello, Rachel here. Just before I'm about to post this episode, I just wanted to jump on and say that I have had some travel plans come up kind of unexpectedly. And so just to give a heads up, the next episode of the podcast, which is being prepared as we speak, but it will be a week late. So it'll come out, I think it'll just miss March. It'll be the first day or two of April, but then we'll be 2 weeks again after that. Just wanted to give people a heads up and so you don't wonder where I've gone. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and I'll be speaking to you soon. Goodbye. This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.